The real situation in Pokrovsk, the destruction of targets inside Russia and the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. This is the war map on freedom. I'm Oleg Borisov, hello. Let's start with the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. The situation is difficult but under the control of the defense forces. President Zelensky stated this. Despite the large number of Russian assault groups, Ukraine's defense forces managed to improve their tactical position in several city blocks. This was reported by the 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Air Assault Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Fighting continues in the areas of the settlements of Suketskaya, Rodinskaya, Mirnograd, Mirolubovka, Zavirovoye, Kotlina and Molodetskoye. The Russians are trying to advance, but the armed forces of Ukraine are putting up strong resistance along the entire line of contact. Next, we will discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction in detail. Here, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine is recording Russian assaults. Most of the activity is in the direction of Pleshchevka. The occupiers are trying to advance simultaneously from 3 directions. From the east, from Chasiv Yar, from the south, from the direction of Toretsk, and from the west, from the direction of Mirnograd. All attacks are being repelled by the defense forces. I would like to note that for a long time the Russians have been unable to break through the Ukrainian defenders' lines in this direction. Next, let's talk about the Lyman direction. Here, the Russian occupiers are changing their tactics and are more often launching assaults on foot without heavy equipment. After all, it is immediately destroyed by Ukrainian drones, and this tactic is not new. Previously, the occupiers used it in the Pokrovsk direction. Here, fighting is being recorded in the direction of the settlements of Zeleny Hai, Novoye Horivka, Druzhulubivka, Korovye Yar, and Oleksandrivka. All attacks are being repelled. The situation is under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. And now, I will show you one of the working days of Ukrainian drone operators on the Donetsk front. The following video was shared by the 28th Separate Mechanized Brigade Knights of the Winter campaign. Here you can clearly see how Ukrainian operators and scouts find hidden Russian howitzers and destroy them. By the way, not only the guns are hit here, but also the ammunition and the occupiers' personnel. In just one combat sortie by Ukrainian drones, several underground Russian shelters were detected and destroyed. Let's discuss the situation at the front in more detail with Dmytro Shnyhiryov, a military and political analyst. Dmytro, hello. President Zelensky stated that the situation in Pokrovsk is under the control of the defense forces. What is known about Russian losses as a result of local assaults?
We should probably start with the personnel decisions made by the Ministry of Defense of the occupying country. After the failure of the operation by Russian occupation forces to take control of Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, the chief of the General Staff of the occupying country's army, Gerasimov, held a meeting after which, according to Russian media reports, dismissals took place. The commander of the 51st Army, Lieutenant General Melchakov, and the commander of the 132nd Brigade, Colonel Naimushin, were dismissed from their positions. The official reason given was failure to accomplish objectives and heavy losses. This is quite telling. So there are 2 main points here. The first is the failure to accomplish objectives. In other words, all the statements from the Russian side claiming that the occupying country's army is achieving significant successes in the Pokrovsk and Kubinsk directions turned out to be nothing more than an informational bluff. And the second point is the significant losses suffered by the Russian occupiers. Moreover, it should be noted that according to Ukrainian sources, just in the past day alone, the occupiers' losses in the Pokrovsk direction, specifically in Pokrovsk itself, during stabilization operations by the defense forces of Ukraine, assault units, the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense and Special Operations Forces, about 85 Russian occupiers were eliminated. That's in just one day. In other words, Russian losses are quite significant. It should also be noted that according to the 7th Corps, the airborne assault, the time of the airborne assault troops, Ukrainian soldiers, just in their area of responsibility, 1,320 Russians were eliminated. Another 646 are so-called sanitary losses. So the total number of occupier losses in the area of responsibility of just the 7th Air Assault Corps is about 2,000 personnel. It should also be noted that by decision of the Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, who, by the way, is currently in Pokrovsk and is commanding the operation. This operation is aimed at liberating the districts of the city that are temporarily under the control of the occupiers. So, following Syrski's decision, units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense have been deployed to the city. These units have real combat experience in conducting battles both in urban environments and accordingly in the successful liberation of industrial zones. Let me remind you, it was precisely the redeployment of units from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense that significantly stabilized the situation in Vovchansk. At that time, the aggregate plant was deoccupied and brought under control, and by the way, it still remains under the control of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. This is noteworthy. In addition to the GUAR units, by Syrski's decision, units of the Special Operations Forces and accordingly the Security Service of Ukraine were deployed to conduct counter-sabotage operations, as well as special units from other related agencies, which are currently engaged in identifying and eliminating members of small assault groups of the occupying country's army. So we can say that in every respect, the Russian side's statement about the significant success of the occupying army, the Ukrainian military command responded with more than adequate actions by redeploying operational reserves and stabilizing the situation on the front line. And to give you a sense of the situation in the Pokrovsk direction, over the past week, Ukraine's defense forces have deoccupied 4 settlements. These are respectively Sukebske, and Sukebske. These are Kukarev, Yar, Zatishok, and Shakhovi. So there is no critical situation in the Pokrovsk direction, as Russian media are trying to claim. And I would like to draw the attention of both the Russian side and the Ukrainian special services to this. According to operational information, Russian occupiers are preparing a series of bloody provocations, Pokrovsk under the so-called false flag. The goal of these bloody provocations is to accuse Ukraine's defense forces and Ukrainian intelligence of violating the rules and norms of warfare. In particular, according to operational information, this refers to a staged, that is documented execution of the civilian population that remains in Pokrovsk, allegedly at the time of counter-sabotage operations conducted by special units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense and Special Operations Forces. Moreover, this provocation is being planned by the Russian side to coincide with the possible presence of media representatives. Let me remind you, at one time the Russian dictator stated that the Russian military command must provide security guarantees to journalists who will be covering events in the Pokrovsk direction. And the second bloody provocation is delivering fire strikes on locations of permanent or temporary deployment, targeting the journalists themselves with the aim of once again accusing Ukraine's defense forces of allegedly disrupting informational activities. At the very moment when events in the Pokrovsk direction are being covered. Therefore, all responsibility for these war crimes, and I remind you, these are crimes that violate the Geneva Convention, which has been ratified by the occupying country, will lie with the Russian military personnel, and any attempt at manipulation in the information space will indicate that the Russian special services, let me emphasize this again, have planned and are currently planning the implementation of such actions. Such provocations.
Ukraine is preparing new long-range strikes against the Russian Federation. The president of Ukraine has previously spoken about this. What targets might be meant deep in the rear of the Russian Federation?
We are talking not only about the deep rear of the Russian Federation, but also accordingly about the occupied regions of Ukraine. First and foremost, we are talking about legitimate military targets. That is, these are stationary targets, these are defense industry enterprises, these are oil refining facilities, and accordingly, thermal power plant substations. Let's illustrate that the statements of the Ukrainian president are consistent with the actions of Ukraine's defense forces in practice. Just last night, Ukraine's defense forces carried out a series of strikes on substations and thermal power plants, both in the occupied territories of Ukraine and accordingly on the territory of the Russian Federation. In particular, last night, Ukrainian drones struck substations in Luhansk, Alchevsk, Kadivka, and Pervomest. These are temporarily occupied territories of Luhansk region. There have been reports of widespread power outages among consumers. A blackout has occurred in the territory of the Russian Federation over the past 24 hours. Strikes by Ukrainian Defense Forces drones, Kursk region, specifically Zheleznogorsk. A strike on the substation. The city is completely without power. Lipetsk region. This includes the PSU's traction substation, Usman, and accordingly the city of Orel. A strike was carried out on the Oriol CHP combined heat and power plant. This concerns the blackout, that is, the statements by the Ukrainian president that the Russian side will feel the consequences of retaliatory strikes by Ukrainian UAVs and ballistic means. As we can see, strikes on substations and CHP plants are consistent with the actions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. In addition, over the past night, strikes on oil refineries. It should be noted, first of all, the strike on the oil processing facility and oil terminal in Tuapse. It should be noted that this oil terminal was commissioned in 2013 and is considered one of the most advanced and modern in terms of technical equipment at present. As a result of the strike, according to the Russian side's own assessment, Ukrainian UAVs hit respectively such targets as this is the central trestle, this is the main oil pumping hub, and accordingly we are talking about a strike on an oil tanker which at the moment of the strike was being loaded. It is noteworthy that this oil terminal is capable of pumping about 7 million. In other words, this is a very serious blow to the Russian Federation's ability to supply crude oil and petroleum products to end consumers at this moment. That is, the defense forces of Ukraine continue to successfully strike oil refining facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation. I would like to note that as of November, according to the Russian side's own estimates, about 40% of oil refining facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation have already been put out of operation. And we are talking about strikes carried out exclusively on legitimate military targets on the territory of the occupying country and the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine.
Next, Dimitro, let's talk about the Ukrainian defense industry. Ukraine is launching controlled arms exports. This concerns weapons in sufficient quantities that are stored in warehouses. Does this initiative take Ukraine to a new level in terms of geopolitical security?
Of course. First and foremost, this demonstrates that the Ukrainian defense industry is ready to claim its niche in the international arms market, even under wartime conditions. Primarily, we are talking about high technologies, that is, the adapted experience of manufacturing and practical use of Ukrainian drones. This refers to both maritime drones and accordingly the system, better known as the drone wall. This is Ukrainian know-how in the use of FPV drones. And notably, these are strike drones with a target range of over 2,000 kilometers. In this segment, the Ukrainian side holds a leading position in the world, and even the occupiers are forced to acknowledge this. And there is interest from the United States in acquiring Ukrainian UAVs. Moreover, I should note that during the Ukrainian president's visit to the United States, the issue of supplying Ukrainian UAVs was raised, and the possibility of signing a multi-billion-dollar contract as part of the re-equipment of both NATO armies and, accordingly, the United States Army. In addition to this, at the moment, a number of countries in the Pacific region have shown interest in Ukrainian maritime drones, and this is evidence that our potential partners fully understand both the capabilities of the Ukrainian defense industry and, most importantly, the practical effectiveness of using maritime drones. Let me remind you, as a result of the use of maritime drones, the Ukrainian side managed to destroy about 33% of the vessels of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet. And this is the clearest evidence of the high tactical and technical characteristics of maritime drones. It is precisely this segment that the Ukrainian defense industry will occupy on the global market. And it should be noted that there are virtually no competitors to Ukrainian products. This is acknowledged accordingly by our strategic partners. And accordingly, the army of the occupying country, which has experienced firsthand all the capabilities and tactical technical characteristics of Ukrainian strike systems. And in conclusion, what does this give to the Ukrainian side? First, it is the dynamic development of the Ukrainian defense industry, which in turn will serve as a locomotive for the development of Ukraine's entire industry. Second, it is the creation of jobs and accordingly taxes flowing into the Ukrainian budget. And it is an opportunity to position itself as one of the key producers in the global arms market.
Dimitro, thank you very much for taking the time to join our broadcast. Dimitros Nihirev, military and political analyst, was with us live.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.